Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. True Crime for Sleep. Are you prepared to embrace the dark? If you're drawn to the world of true crime and unsolved mysteries, join our circle. Subscribe and enable all notifications. I am with you and our lullaby starts right now. It was just after midnight when the first strange thing happened on Willowbrook Lane. Most people in the neighborhood were already asleep. The quiet cul-de-sac was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. Streetlights hummed softly above empty driveways, the wind moved gently through the trees, and the houses sat in perfect silence. But house number 58 was different. If you stood at the end of the street and looked toward it, you would notice the red door first. Not just red, a deep, dark crimson that seemed almost black at night. It had been that way for as long as anyone could remember. For years, the house had been empty. No cars in the driveway. No lights in the windows. No laughter, no music, no footsteps. Just silence. Neighbors often joked that the place was haunted. Kids dared each other to run up and touch the red door before sprinting away in terror. Over time, people simply accepted that number 58 was the forgotten house on Willowbrook Lane. Until one morning, when everything changed. It started quietly. A moving truck appeared at the end of the street just after sunrise. Most people were leaving for work when they noticed it. The truck slowly backed into the driveway of house number 58. That alone was strange. No one had seen a for sale sign. No one knew the house had been bought. But someone was moving in. The neighbors watched from their windows as two men unloaded furniture. Large boxes disappeared into the dark hallway beyond the red door. No one came out to greet the neighborhood. No introductions. No friendly waves. Just silence. By evening, the truck was gone, and the house was occupied again. At first, people assumed it was just a private family. Some people preferred to keep to themselves. There was nothing wrong with that. But something about the house felt wrong. Lights rarely turned on at night. When they did, they were dim and brief, like someone moving quickly from room to room. No one ever saw the family outside. Days passed, then weeks. No children playing in the yard. No gardening. No mail being collected from the box. It was as if the house had returned to being empty, except now someone was inside. The first person to really notice the strange pattern was Susan Dolly. Susan had lived on Willowbrook Lane for nearly 15 years. Her living room window faced directly toward house number 58, and she had a habit of noticing small details others missed. One evening, while washing dishes, she saw a light flicker in the upstairs window. For a moment, a small figure appeared behind the curtain. A child. He stood there for only a few seconds before disappearing. Susan smiled. Finally, she thought, there's a kid living there. But something about the boy bothered her. The way he stood at the window. He didn't wave. He didn't move around the room. He just stood there, perfectly still, staring out into the street. Then the light turned off. The window went dark again. Susan didn't think much of it that night, but the image of the boy stayed in her mind. A few days later, something happened that no one on Willowbrook Lane would ever forget. It was a Saturday night. Around 10:30 p.m., the neighborhood was quiet as usual. A few families were watching television. Others were getting ready for bed. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. It came from house number 58. Several neighbors looked up from their living rooms at the exact same moment. Then they heard something else. A woman's voice. It sounded like a scream, but it wasn't long. Just one sharp cry, and then silence again. Lights flicked on in nearby houses as people stepped outside to look down the street. Frank Miller, who lived across from number 58, stood on his porch and stared toward the house. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Susan had come outside too. "I think it came from inside," she said quietly. The red door remained closed. The windows were dark. Nothing moved. For a long time, the neighbors simply stood there in the cold night air, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, people went back inside, convincing themselves it was probably nothing. Maybe something fell. Maybe someone dropped a heavy object. Maybe the scream wasn't a scream at all. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. 2 nights later, the smell of smoke drifted across Willowbrook Lane. It was faint at first, then stronger. Frank Miller stepped outside again and immediately noticed it. Smoke was rising from the small basement window of house number 58. "Fire!" he shouted. Several neighbors ran outside. Someone called the fire department, while Frank grabbed a garden hose and ran toward the house. But just as he reached the yard, the smoke stopped. Completely. No flames. No alarms. No one came out of the house. The firefighters arrived a few minutes later and knocked loudly on the red door. After a long pause, it opened slightly. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall and thin, with pale skin and dark hair. His expression was calm, almost too calm. The firefighters asked if everything was all right. The man said it was just a small accident in the basement. Nothing serious. They asked if they could check inside. The man hesitated, just for a moment. Then he said it wasn't necessary. The fire was already out. The firefighters looked at each other, uncertain. Without visible flames or alarms, there wasn't much they could legally do. Eventually, they left, and the red door closed again. That was the moment when people on Willowbrook Lane began to feel something was very wrong. Days later, Susan Dolly saw the boy again. It was late afternoon, and she was watering her plants when she glanced toward house number 58. The upstairs curtain moved slightly. The boy was standing there again. This time, she could see him clearly. He looked thin, too thin. His face was pale, and his dark hair hung messily over his eyes. But that wasn't what made Susan's stomach tighten. It was the bruises. Dark marks covered one side of the boy's face. Another bruise was visible on his arm. The boy didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply stared at Susan. And slowly, he raised his hand and pressed it against the window. Susan stepped closer to the sidewalk. "Hello," she called gently. The boy didn't respond. He just stood there, watching her. And for the first time, Susan realized something chilling. The boy wasn't just looking outside. He was looking for help. But before Susan could say anything else, a shadow appeared behind him. The boy's eyes widened in fear. And suddenly, he vanished from the window. The curtain snapped shut. Susan stood frozen in the street, her heart beating faster than it had in years. Something was happening inside that house. Something terrible. And deep down, she knew. That red door was hiding a secret no one on Willowbrook Lane was ready to discover. For the next few days, Susan Dolly could not stop thinking about the boy in the window. Every time she passed by her living room, her eyes automatically drifted toward house number 58. The red door looked the same as always, silent, closed, and strangely menacing under the streetlights. But now she knew someone inside needed help. Or at least she thought he did. At first, Susan tried to convince herself she might have misunderstood what she saw. Bruises could happen to children. Kids fall while playing. They get hurt. But something about the boy's eyes haunted her. They hadn't looked like the eyes of a child who simply fell off a bicycle. They looked frightened, deeply frightened. That night, Susan mentioned it to her husband during dinner. "I saw the boy again," she said quietly. Her husband barely looked up from his plate. "The one in the red door house." "Yes, and—" Susan hesitated. "He had bruises." Her husband sighed softly. "Kids get bruises all the time." "No," Susan said, shaking her head slowly. "This was different." But even as she spoke, she could hear how uncertain she sounded. After all, she had only seen the boy for a few seconds. Maybe she really was overthinking it. Still, the uneasy feeling refused to leave her. A few evenings later, several neighbors gathered for the monthly homeowner association meeting at Frank Miller's house. These meetings were usually boring. Discussions about lawn maintenance, garbage collection schedules, and parking rules filled most of the time. But that night, Susan brought up house number 58. "I think something strange is happening there," she said carefully. The room fell quiet for a moment. Frank leaned back in his chair. "Strange how?" Susan explained everything she had seen. The quiet family, the scream, the smoke from the basement, and finally, the bruised boy in the window. A few people exchanged uncomfortable looks. One woman spoke first. "Maybe the kid just got into a fight at school." Another neighbor added, "Or maybe we're just imagining things because that house has always been creepy." Frank rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "What about the father?" he asked. "Has anyone talked to him?" No one had. No one had even seen him, except the night the firefighters came. "He seemed odd," Frank said slowly, "but I didn't see anything illegal." Susan felt frustration rising in her chest. "We should at least check on the boy," she insisted. "What if he's being hurt?" The room grew quiet again. Finally, someone said the thing everyone else had been thinking. "What if we're wrong?" The words hung in the air. Accusing someone of hurting their child was serious. If they called the police without proof, it could ruin an innocent family. After a long discussion, the neighbors agreed on one thing. They would keep an eye on the house, but they would do nothing else. Susan left the meeting feeling uneasy. Watching wasn't enough. Not anymore. Over the next week, the strange events continued. Children playing on the street began complaining about noises coming from the house. One afternoon, 2 boys knocked on Susan's door. "Mrs. Dolly," one of them said nervously, "there's something weird in that house." Susan knelt down to their level. "What do you mean?" The boys glanced at each other. "We heard someone crying," the other whispered. "From the red door house." They nodded. "Like a kid crying," the first boy said, "but really quiet, like he was trying not to be heard." Susan's stomach tightened. "Did you see anything?" "No," the boy said, "but the window upstairs was open just a little." Susan thanked them and closed the door slowly. Now she was certain. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Then one morning, the school bus driver stopped Susan while she was checking her mail. "Do you know the family at number 58? He asked. Susan frowned. "Not really, why?" The driver looked confused. "I've been driving this route for 12 years, he said. "Every kid on this street rides my bus." Susan felt a chill crawl up her spine. "And there's supposed to be a boy living in that house," the driver said, "but he's never once come out for school." Susan stared at him. "Never, not once." That was the moment when the whispers on Willowbrook Lane turned into fear. People began noticing more things. The father left the house late at night. Sometimes he didn't return until early morning. The lights inside the house flickered at strange hours. And the boy appeared at the window more often now. Each time he looked worse. His face grew thinner. The bruises seemed darker. One evening, Susan saw him again while walking her dog. This time, he was pressing something against the glass. A small piece of paper. Susan moved closer, squinting to read it. Her heart nearly stopped. Written in shaky letters on the paper was one single word. Please. Susan's dog barked loudly. The boy's eyes widened in panic. He quickly pulled the paper down and looked behind him. Then he turned back to the window and mouthed something silently. Susan couldn't hear the words, but she could read his lips. Help me. Before she could react, the boy was yanked away from the window. The curtain slammed shut. Susan stood frozen on the sidewalk. Her heart pounded in her chest. That was no misunderstanding. That was no accident. The boy inside house number 58 was begging for help. That night, Susan called Frank immediately. You need to come over, she said. Within minutes, Frank and another neighbor, David Green, were sitting in Susan's living room. David was a retired police officer who had moved to Willowbrook Lane a few years earlier. Susan explained everything. The paper, the word please, the silent cry for help. David listened carefully, his expression growing darker with every detail. When she finished, he leaned forward. Did anyone else see it? No, Susan said. David sighed. That makes things complicated. Frank crossed his arms. What do you mean? If we call the police, David said, they'll knock on the door, ask a few questions, and leave. Without evidence, there's not much they can do. Susan felt anger rising again. So we just ignore it. David didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window toward house number 58. The red door sat under the streetlight like a dark warning. Finally, David spoke quietly. No, he said. We don't ignore it. Susan and Frank looked at him. David's voice was calm, but there was steel in it. We find out what's happening inside that house. Outside, the wind moved through the trees of Willowbrook Lane. And in the upstairs window of house number 58. For just a moment, a small shadow appeared behind the curtain again. The night the neighbors decided to investigate house number 58, the wind on Willowbrook Lane felt colder than usual. The street looked the same as it always had. Quiet homes, dim streetlights, perfect lawns. Nothing about the peaceful cul-de-sac suggested that something horrifying might be hiding behind one of its doors. But 3 people knew the truth. Susan Dolly stood at her living room window again, staring at the red door across the street. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a mug of tea that had already gone cold. Frank Miller was packing slowly behind her. And David Green, the retired police officer, sat calmly at the kitchen table. But inside his mind, years of police instincts were working. Something was wrong inside that house. Very wrong. For days, David had been watching. He noticed patterns the others didn't. The father leaving late at night. The strange hours. The windows that never opened. The boy who appeared only when no adults seemed to be nearby. And most disturbing of all, the silent messages. Please, help me. Those weren't the actions of a child living in a normal home. Those were the actions of a child trapped somewhere he couldn't escape. Earlier that evening, Susan had seen the boy again. This time, the message had been different. When she looked up at the window, the boy was already staring directly at her. His eyes were wide with fear. He pressed his hands against the glass and leaned forward. Then he slowly mouthed a single word. Run. Susan felt her stomach drop. Before she could react, a shadow appeared behind the boy again. He disappeared instantly. The curtain snapped closed. That was when Susan called David. Now, hours later, the 3 neighbors were sitting in silence. Frank finally spoke. "So what's the plan?" David leaned back slightly in his chair. "We wait." "For what?" Frank asked. "For him to leave." They all knew who he meant. The father. Over the past week, David had noticed the man leaving the house almost every night sometime after midnight. If that pattern continued tonight, they might finally have a chance to see what was happening inside. Susan felt nervous just thinking about it. "Isn't this illegal?" she whispered. David gave a small shrug. "So is locking a child in a house and beating him." No one argued. Time passed slowly. The clock on Susan's wall ticked loudly. 11:47 p.m. 11:59 p.m. 12:13 a.m. Then suddenly, headlights flashed across the living room wall. All three of them rushed to the window. Across the street, the red door opened. The father stepped outside. He looked exactly the same as the night of the fire. Tall, thin, pale. His face showed no emotion. He locked the door behind him, walked to a dark sedan parked in the driveway, and got inside. The engine started. A moment later, the car rolled slowly down the street and disappeared around the corner. David checked his watch. "All right," he said calmly. "Let's go." Susan's heart started racing. They stepped outside into the cold night air. The entire street was silent. Only the faint hum of insects and distant traffic could be heard. The three of them crossed the road together. Standing in front of house number 58 felt different than watching it from across the street. The place felt heavier somehow. Oppressive. The red door stood directly in front of them. Up close, the paint looked darker than Susan remembered. Almost like dried blood. Frank cleared his throat. "You sure about this?" David nodded. He pulled a small flashlight from his pocket. "Stay close." He reached toward the door and slowly turned the handle. Locked. No surprise there. David stepped back and examined the lock carefully. Years of police work had taught him many things, including how to open doors that didn't want to be opened. Within seconds, he slipped a small tool into the lock. Click. The door opened. All three of them froze. Waiting. Listening. Nothing. David pushed the door open slowly. The house was completely dark inside. A stale, cold smell drifted out from the hallway. "Stay behind me," David whispered. They stepped inside. The door closed quietly behind them. Immediately, Susan noticed something strange. The house felt empty. Not quiet. Empty. Like no one truly lived there. The living room contained only a few pieces of furniture. A couch. A small table. A single lamp. Everything looked perfectly arranged, but unused. Dust covered the surfaces. Frank frowned. "Does anyone actually live here?" David didn't answer. He was already moving toward the kitchen. His flashlight beam slid across the walls as they walked. The air grew colder the deeper they went. When they reached the kitchen, David suddenly stopped. His light had landed on something. The freezer. It stood against the far wall. Large, industrial, and humming loudly. Susan stepped closer. "Why would someone need a freezer that big?" she whispered. David slowly opened the lid. The moment it lifted, a horrible smell filled the room. Susan covered her mouth instantly. Frank stumbled backward. Inside the freezer were several large plastic bags. And inside those bags, something pale. Something that looked disturbingly human. David closed the lid immediately. His voice was tense now. "We need to find the boy." They hurried toward the staircase. Every step creaked under their weight. The second-floor hallway was narrow and dark. 3 doors. The first was empty. The second contained nothing but a mattress on the floor. But the third door was locked from the outside. Susan felt her breath catch. David slowly unlocked it. The door creaked open. Inside the small room, a boy sat curled in the corner. He looked even thinner than before. Bruises covered his arms. His eyes were hollow with exhaustion. For a moment, he just stared at them in shock. Then he whispered something so quietly, they almost didn't hear it. "You came." Susan rushed forward. "It's okay," she said gently. "We're here to help you." The boy stood weakly. "My name is Ethan," he said. David immediately moved toward the window and looked outside. His police instincts were screaming now. Something about this felt wrong. Very wrong. Then suddenly, headlights flashed across the street outside. David's heart dropped. A car door slammed. Footsteps approached the house. The father had come back. The sound of the car door slamming outside froze everyone in the room. For a moment, no one moved. David slowly turned his head toward the window again. Through the thin curtain, he could see the headlights of the dark sedan shining across the lawn. The father had returned, much earlier than usual. David's voice dropped to a whisper. "We have to leave now." Susan grabbed Ethan gently by the shoulders. "Can you walk?" The boy nodded weakly, but it was clear he had very little strength left. Frank moved toward the hallway, trying to stay quiet, but the old wooden floor creaked beneath his weight. Downstairs, the front door opened. The sound echoed through the silent house like a gunshot. Everyone upstairs froze. Heavy footsteps entered the hallway below. Slow, deliberate, as if the man already knew something was wrong. David's mind was racing. There was no way they could walk past him and get out the front door, which meant there was only one option. "The window," he whispered. He quickly pushed it open. Cold night air rushed into the room. They were on the second floor. It was a long drop, but not impossible. David turned to Frank. "You go first, then help Ethan." Frank nodded and climbed out onto the small ledge. Carefully, he lowered himself until he was hanging by his hands. Then he dropped. The impact made him grunt softly, but he quickly stood and looked up. "I'm good," he whispered. Inside the room, the footsteps downstairs stopped. Complete silence filled the house. Susan held Ethan's hand tightly. "Come on," she said softly. David helped the boy climb onto the ledge. Ethan hesitated for a moment, fear in his eyes. "It's okay," David assured him. "Frank will catch you." The boy slowly lowered himself. Frank reached up and grabbed him just as he let go. They both landed safely. Now only Susan and David remained. Downstairs, a floorboard creaked. The man was moving again. But this time, he was heading toward the stairs. David gestured quickly. "Go." Susan climbed onto the ledge and dropped down. Frank steadied her as she landed. Now David was alone. He could hear the footsteps clearly now. Step, step, step. The man was halfway up the staircase. David swung his legs out the window and lowered himself as fast as he could. Just as he let go, the upstairs hallway light flicked on. The father had reached the top of the stairs. David hit the ground hard and rolled across the grass. Frank pulled him up immediately. "Run," David said. They didn't wait. The 4 of them ran across the lawn and into the dark trees at the edge of Willowbrook Lane. Behind them, the upstairs window slammed open. A cold voice echoed through the night. "Ethan!" The boy flinched. Susan tightened her grip on his hand. "Don't look back," she whispered. Branches snapped beneath their feet as they rushed deeper into the woods. Finally, after several minutes of running, they stopped near the edge of a small clearing. Frank bent over, breathing heavily. "Is he following us?" David listened carefully. The forest was silent. "No," he said. Susan knelt beside Ethan. "You're safe now," she told him. The boy looked exhausted, but his eyes were wide with fear. "He'll come back," Ethan whispered. "Who?" Frank asked. "My father." David pulled out his phone and dialed the police. Within minutes, sirens could be heard approaching Willowbrook Lane. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees as several patrol cars arrived at the house. Officers rushed inside. More cars arrived. Soon the entire street was filled with police. But something strange happened. The father was gone. No one had seen him leave. Officers searched every room. The basement, the attic, the yard, but the man had disappeared completely. What they did find inside the house shocked everyone. The large freezer in the kitchen was filled with plastic bags containing bones. Human bones. Several rooms upstairs contained strange objects, drawings, and old photographs of children no one could identify. And Ethan's room. It was barely a room at all. Just a mattress on the floor, chains attached to the wall, and hundreds of scratches carved into the paint. Later that night, Ethan sat wrapped in a blanket in the back of an ambulance. Susan sat beside him. Police officers moved around the scene while detectives began their investigation. One officer approached David. "You were the one who called." David nodded. The officer looked back at the house. "Who lives there?" David answered quietly. "That's the problem. No one seems to know." Across the street, neighbors stood outside watching the flashing lights. Everyone on Willowbrook Lane could feel it. Something terrible had been living in that house. But the most frightening part was that the man responsible had vanished, and no one knew where he went. As Ethan sat silently in the ambulance, he stared back toward the house one last time. His voice was barely a whisper. "He's not finished." Susan looked at him. "What do you mean?" Ethan's eyes remained locked on the dark window of the second floor. "He always comes back." The investigation into house number 58 should have brought relief to Willowbrook Lane. Police cars had filled the street. Detectives had searched every room. Forensic teams spent hours inside the house collecting evidence. And Ethan, the boy from the window, was finally safe. But strangely, the fear on Willowbrook Lane didn't disappear. If anything, it grew worse. Because the one person everyone wanted to find was gone. The father had vanished without a trace. No one saw him leave the house. No car had been spotted on nearby roads. No footprints were found in the yard. It was as if the man had simply disappeared into the night. Detective Claire Donnelly arrived early the next morning. She was known across the county for handling complicated cases. Tall, sharp-eyed, and calm under pressure, Claire had spent years working crimes that most officers preferred not to think about. But the moment she stepped inside house number 58, she knew this case was different. The air inside the house felt heavy. Not just because of what had been discovered in the freezer. There was something else. Something difficult to explain. Claire stood in the kitchen while forensic officers carefully photographed the large freezer. Inside were multiple plastic bags containing bones. Some looked old, others looked disturbingly recent. "How many victims?" Claire asked. The forensic technician shook his head. "Too early to say." Claire didn't like that answer. She turned toward the staircase. Where was the boy found? Second floor, the officer replied. Claire slowly climbed the stairs. Each step creaked beneath her shoes. At the end of the hallway, she reached the small locked room where Ethan had been kept. The door was now wide open. Claire stepped inside. The room was smaller than she expected. Bare walls, a thin mattress on the floor, chains attached to metal rings bolted into the wall. But what caught her attention immediately were the drawings, hundreds of them. They covered nearly every inch of the walls. Childlike sketches made with pencils, crayons, even pieces of charcoal. Most of the drawings showed the same thing. A small boy, standing next to a tall man. The man had no face, just a blank, empty shape where his features should be. Claire stared at one of the drawings. Who drew these? She asked. One of the officers behind her answered. The boy. Claire crouched closer to the wall. Every drawing looked slightly different, but the faceless man appeared in all of them. Sometimes standing beside the boy, sometimes standing in the corner of the room, sometimes standing behind the red door. Claire felt a small chill run down her spine. She stood up slowly. Where is Ethan now? At the hospital, the officer said. Doctors are checking him out. Claire nodded. I want to speak with him. An hour later, Claire walked into a quiet hospital room. Ethan sat on the bed, wrapped in a blanket. Up close, he looked even smaller than she expected. His arms were covered in fatting bruises. Dark circles hung under his eyes. But the thing Claire noticed most was how alert he seemed. He wasn't crying. He wasn't confused. He looked like someone who had been waiting a long time for someone to finally listen. Claire pulled a chair beside the bed. Hi, Ethan, she said gently. The boy looked at her. Are you the police? Claire smiled softly. Yes. He nodded slowly. Are you going to catch him? Claire paused for a moment. We're going to try. Ethan stared down at his hands. After a few seconds, he whispered something unexpected. You won't find him. Claire leaned forward slightly. Why not? Ethan lifted his eyes. Because he doesn't stay in one place. The words hung in the quiet room. Claire studied the boy carefully. Ethan, she said softly, can you tell me about your father? The boy was silent for several seconds. Then he shook his head. He wasn't my father. Claire frowned. What do you mean? Ethan looked toward the window. He told people he was, the boy said quietly, but he was. Claire felt her attention sharpen. Then who was he? Ethan's voice dropped to a whisper. I don't know. Claire asked more questions. Where had Ethan lived before? How long had he been in the house? Did he remember other children? Some questions Ethan answered. Others he avoided. But one detail kept repeating. The faceless man. The one in the drawings, Claire asked. Ethan nodded slowly. He likes the red door. Claire felt that chill again. What red door? Ethan looked confused. The one in the house. There's only one red door, Claire said. The front door. Ethan shook his head immediately. No. His voice trembled slightly. The other one. Claire leaned closer. There's another red door. Ethan's eyes slowly lifted to meet hers. Yes. Where? The boy hesitated. Then he said something that made Claire's skin crawl. It only appears when he opens it. Claire sat back in her chair. For the first time since arriving on Willowbrook Lane, she felt something she rarely experienced during an investigation. Uncertainty. Outside the hospital room, Officers continued searching for the missing man. Inside the abandoned house, forensic teams collected evidence late into the night. But far away from the flashing police lights, something inside house number 58 had not been discovered yet. Because deep inside the house, behind a wall no one had opened, there was still another door, and it was painted the same dark red as the one at the front of the house. Detective Claire Donnelly had heard many strange things during her years in law enforcement. People lied. People imagined things. Children, especially, sometimes created stories to protect themselves from painful memories. But as Claire sat in the hospital room listening to Ethan, something about the boy's voice didn't feel like imagination. It felt like fear. Real fear. The kind that comes from seeing something you cannot explain. Claire folded her hands calmly. "Ethan," she said gently, "I need you to tell me about the other red door." The boy looked down at the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. For a moment he didn't speak. Then slowly he began. "It's not always there." Claire stayed quiet, letting him continue. "Sometimes the wall looks normal," Ethan said, "but when he comes it changes." "What changes?" "The door appears." Claire frowned slightly. "Where exactly?" "In the hallway," Ethan whispered, "near the stairs." Claire thought back to the house. She had walked through that hallway herself. There had been no other door. "Did you ever go inside it?" she asked. Ethan shook his head immediately. "No." "Why not?" The boy's eyes filled with quiet dread. "Because the other kids did." Claire felt her chest tighten. "What other kids?" Ethan slowly looked up at her. "The ones who never came back." The room fell silent. Claire kept her expression calm, but inside her mind questions were racing. "How many children?" she asked carefully. Ethan shrugged weakly. "I don't know." "Did you see them?" "Sometimes." "Where?" "In the house," he said, "before they disappeared." Claire leaned slightly forward. "And your father?" "He would take them to the door." "What happened then?" Ethan swallowed hard. "He would open it." Claire waited. But Ethan didn't continue. "What did you see when he opened it?" she asked. The boy shook his head again. "Nothing." "What do you mean, nothing?" "There was only darkness." Claire felt a strange uneasiness creeping into her thoughts. "Did you ever hear anything from inside?" Ethan hesitated. Then he nodded slowly. "Whispers." The word lingered in the air. "What kind of whispers?" Claire asked. "I couldn't understand them," Ethan said quietly, "but they were always calling." Claire took a slow breath. "And the man, the one who kept you there, what did he say about it?" Ethan stared at the floor. "He said the door belonged to him." "Who?" The boy looked back at her. "The faceless man." Claire didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pulled a small notebook from her coat and opened it. "Ethan," she said softly, "can you tell me about the drawings in your room?" The boy nodded. "He told me to draw him." "Who?" "The faceless man." "Why?" Ethan's voice grew quieter. "So he wouldn't forget the way back." Claire's pen stopped moving. "The way back to where?" Ethan answered almost instantly. "The door." For the first time during the interview, Claire felt a genuine chill. She closed the notebook slowly. "Ethan," she said gently, "I'm going to go back to the house today." The boy's eyes widened slightly. "Why?" "I want to see if this other door exists." Ethan looked frightened. "You shouldn't open it." Claire gave a small reassuring smile. "I won't." But the boy shook his head again. "That's not what I meant." Claire paused. "What did you mean?" Ethan's voice dropped to a whisper. If you find it, it might open itself. Later that afternoon, Claire returned to Willowbrook Lane. The house was now surrounded by police tape. Forensic teams were finishing their work, packing equipment into vans. The street looked tense. Neighbors stood outside watching quietly. Susan Dolly approached Claire as she stepped out of her car. Did you talk to Ethan? Susan asked nervously. Claire nodded. How is he? He's safe, Claire replied. Susan looked relieved, but Claire could see the worry still in her eyes. Did he say anything about that man? Susan asked. Some things, Claire said carefully. She didn't mention the second red door. Not yet. Claire walked toward house number 58. Standing in front of the red door again felt different during the daytime. The paint looked even darker now, almost like it absorbed the sunlight. She stepped inside. The house was mostly empty now. Evidence had been collected, rooms photographed, but the uneasy feeling still remained. Claire walked slowly toward the staircase. Her mind replayed Ethan's words. The door appears near the stairs. She reached the hallway and turned on her flashlight. The walls looked normal. Plain white paint. No doors except the bedrooms. Claire moved closer to the staircase. She ran her hand along the wall. Solid. No gaps. No hidden frame. One of the officers approached her, looking for something detective. Claire hesitated. Possibly a hidden door. The officer looked surprised. In this wall. Claire nodded. They tapped along the surface. Nothing. Just solid wood and drywall. After 20 minutes of searching, the officer shook his head. There's nothing here. Claire stepped back. Maybe Ethan had imagined it. Maybe trauma had twisted his memories. Still, something bothered her. She turned toward the staircase. And that was when she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, right where the wall met the corner, a faint line in the paint. Thin, almost invisible, like the outline of a door frame. Claire slowly walked toward it. The officer followed. What is it? He asked. Claire raised her flashlight. The beam revealed something chilling. A small metal handle, painted the exact same color as the wall. Hidden perfectly. Until now. The officer stared. How did we miss that? Claire didn't answer. She simply stood there staring at the shape of the door. Something about it felt wrong. Very wrong. The hallway suddenly felt colder. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the officer reached for the handle. But before he could touch it, Claire grabbed his wrist. Wait. He looked at her. What's wrong? Claire didn't know how to explain it, but every instinct in her body was warning her. This door should not be opened. Behind them, the house remained completely silent. But on the other side of the hidden door, something moved. Softly, like someone or something was waiting. The hidden door at the end of the hallway should not have existed. Detective Claire Donnelly stood in front of it, her flashlight illuminating the faint outline in the wall. The paint covering it matched the rest of the hallway perfectly, making it almost impossible to notice unless you were standing directly in front of it. Which raised one disturbing question. Why would someone hide a door this carefully? The officer beside her leaned closer. You think this is what the boy was talking about? Claire didn't answer immediately. She slowly ran the beam of her flashlight across the surface. The door looked old, older than the rest of the house. Tiny cracks in the paint suggested that it had been there long before the current owner moved in. Her instincts told her something important. This wasn't something the man had built. This door had been here already. "Step back," Claire said quietly. The officer moved a few feet away. Claire pulled on a pair of gloves from her coat pocket. Slowly, she reached toward the small metal handle. For a moment, she hesitated. Ethan's warning echoed in her mind. "If you find it, it might open itself." Claire took a slow breath and gripped the handle. It was ice cold. She gently turned it. The handle moved easily. Too easily. With a quiet creak, the door opened inward. Both officers immediately raised their flashlights. Inside was a small room. Bare. Empty. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a storage space hidden inside the wall. But the moment Claire stepped inside, she noticed something strange. The air felt different. Colder. Heavier. Almost as if the room had been sealed for a very long time. "What is this place?" the officer whispered. Claire moved the flashlight across the walls. They were covered with drawings. Hundreds of them. Just like the ones in Ethan's room upstairs. Childlike sketches scratched into the paint. Crayon marks. Pencil outlines. Even dark charcoal streaks. And every drawing showed the same terrifying figure. The faceless man. Some drawings showed him standing beside children. Others showed him near a tall door. And in several pictures, the door was glowing. Claire crouched closer to one of the drawings. The crayon marks were messy, rushed, almost desperate. One picture showed a small stick figure standing in front of the faceless man. Above it, written in uneven letters, were two words. "He waits." The officer shifted nervously behind her. "This is seriously creepy." Claire continued examining the wall. Another drawing caught her attention. This one looked newer. The crayon colors were brighter. At the center was a picture of the red door. But instead of the house entrance, this one stood alone in darkness. And standing beside it was the faceless man. Claire leaned closer. Underneath the drawing, a message had been scratched into the paint. "Don't open." Claire slowly stood. "Call the forensic team back in," she said quietly. The officer nodded and stepped out into the hallway. Claire remained inside the hidden room alone. Her flashlight moved across the floor. That's when she saw the scratches. Deep marks carved into the wooden boards, as if something heavy had been dragged across the floor repeatedly. The marks led toward the far wall. Claire followed them carefully. At first the wall looked normal, but as she got closer, she saw another shape, another outline, another door. This one was different. The frame was thicker, older, and unlike the hidden hallway door, this one was painted a deep, dark red. Claire felt her heart begin to pound. This had to be the door Ethan described. The second red door. It stood silently in the far corner of the hidden room. Unlike the front door of the house, this one had no visible hinges. No lock, just a smooth red surface, and a single black handle. Claire slowly raised her flashlight toward it. The red paint looked strange, uneven, almost like it had been repainted many times. But beneath the layers, darker stains showed through. She stepped closer. The air grew colder. Her breath became visible in the beam of the flashlight. Claire reached out and touched the door. Instantly, a sharp chill shot through her hand. She pulled back. Something about the door felt wrong. Not just physically, but deeply wrong. Behind her, footsteps returned. The officer re-entered the room. "Forensics are on the way," he said. Then he noticed the door. "What the hell is that?" Claire stepped aside so he could see it clearly. This, she said slowly, might be what Ethan was talking about. The officer approached cautiously. Should we open it? Claire didn't answer. She stared at the door. Something inside her mind was warning her not to touch it. But the investigator in her needed answers. Finally, she spoke. No. The officer looked surprised. We wait for the team. But as she said the words, something strange happened. The black handle on the red door moved. Slowly, on its own. Both of them froze. Neither had touched it. The handle turned halfway, then stopped. The room became completely silent. The officer whispered nervously, "Did you see that?" Claire nodded slowly. Her voice was barely audible. "Yes." The handle moved again. This time, it turned all the way, and the red door creaked open. A thin line of darkness appeared in the gap. But it wasn't normal darkness. It looked deeper, endless, like a hole leading somewhere far beyond the walls of the house. From inside that darkness, a sound emerged. Soft, barely noticeable. A whisper. Claire leaned slightly closer, trying to hear it clearly. At first, the whisper sounded like random noise. Then slowly, the words became clear. "Let me out." The officer stepped backward instantly. Oh, hell no. But Claire couldn't move. She stared into the darkness beyond the door. And for a split second, she thought she saw something inside. A tall shape, standing very still, watching, and where its face should have been, there was nothing at all. The whisper stopped. For several seconds, the room was completely silent. Detective Claire Donnelly stood frozen in front of the red door, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. The thin opening revealed nothing but endless darkness, swallowing the light beam before it could reach anything solid. The officer behind her stepped back another pace. "Detective, we should close that." Claire didn't answer. Her eyes remained locked on the narrow crack in the door. The whisper she had heard seconds earlier echoed inside her mind. "Let me out." She had investigated murders, kidnappings, and crimes that most people could barely imagine. But nothing in her career had prepared her for this. "Claire," the officer said more urgently now, "this isn't normal." That finally broke her focus. She slowly reached toward the door and pushed it shut. The red surface closed with a dull thud. The moment it sealed, the cold air in the room faded slightly. Both of them exhaled at the same time. "What the hell was that?" the officer muttered. Claire rubbed her temple. "I don't know." More footsteps echoed from the hallway as the forensic team arrived. Cameras, lights, and equipment quickly filled the small hidden room. The investigators immediately began photographing the walls, the drawings, and the strange red door. One of the technicians approached Claire. "Detective, you said this door opened by itself." Claire nodded. "And you heard something inside?" "Yes." The technician looked uneasy, but continued documenting everything carefully. Another officer tried the handle. This time it didn't move. It felt completely locked. He pulled harder. "Nothing. It won't open," he said. Claire frowned slightly. "That's impossible." "I'm serious," the officer replied. "It's stuck." Claire stepped forward again. "Let me try." She gripped the black handle. Just like before. It felt freezing cold. She pulled. The door didn't move at all. The officer shook his head. "You see, it's sealed." Claire stared at the door in confusion. Just minutes earlier, it had opened easily. Now it felt like solid concrete, almost as if the house itself had decided the door should stay closed. Behind her, one of the forensic specialists suddenly spoke. "Detective, you should look at this." Claire turned. The technician was pointing at the floor, right in front of the red door. Claire crouched down. There were marks carved into the wooden boards, deep grooves, as if something with sharp edges had scraped across the floor repeatedly. But what made them disturbing was the direction. The scratches weren't leading toward the door. They were leading away from it, as if something had come out. The officer swallowed nervously. "That doesn't make sense." Claire didn't respond. Her mind was racing. She stood up slowly and looked at the drawings again. The faceless man appeared in nearly every one. Watching, waiting, standing beside the red door. One drawing near the corner suddenly caught her attention. Unlike the others, this one looked older. The paper had yellowed slightly, and the crayon lines were faded. Claire leaned closer. The picture showed several children standing in a hallway. Behind them was the red door, and standing inside the doorway was the faceless man. But this time something was different. The children weren't facing the door. They were running away from it. Above the drawing were 3 words written in shaky letters. "He is here." Claire felt a sudden chill run down her spine. Because the handwriting didn't match Ethan. This drawing had been made by someone else. A different child. A long time ago. One of the technicians suddenly asked a question. "Detective, how old is this house?" Claire turned to another officer. "Do we have records?" The officer pulled out his tablet and checked quickly. "Built in 1972. Claire crossed her arms. "And previous owners." The officer scrolled through the information. "There have been several. Any incidents reported here?" The officer paused. Then his expression changed. "Actually, yes." Claire stepped closer. "What kind of incident?" The officer read from the screen. "Missing child case, 1986. The room went silent. "Details?" Claire asked. "A boy named Michael Carter," the officer said. 7 years old, disappeared inside the house. Claire felt the tension in the room grow. "What happened?" The officer continued reading. "According to the report, the mother claimed he vanished from his bedroom during the night. Was the house searched?" "Yes. And they never found him." Claire slowly turned her head toward the red door again. The scratches on the floor. The drawings on the walls. The whispers inside the darkness. Suddenly, everything felt connected. But before she could say anything else, a loud noise came from the hallway. Everyone turned toward the sound. An officer rushed into the room, breathing heavily. "Detective." Claire looked at him. "What is it?" "There's someone outside." "Who?" The officer hesitated. "A woman." Claire frowned. "And she says she used to live here." The room fell silent. Claire's voice was calm but tense. "What's her name?" The officer answered quietly. "Evelyn Carter." Claire's eyes widened slightly. "That's the mother," she said. "The one whose son disappeared in 1986. Outside the house, a nervous middle-aged woman stood behind the police tape, staring at the red door of house number 58. Her hands were shaking, and when Claire approached her, the woman said something that made every officer nearby go silent. "I heard it opened again." Claire studied her carefully. "What opened?" The woman slowly lifted her eyes to the second-floor window. Then she whispered, "The door that took my son." The woman standing outside house number 58 looked like someone who had spent decades carrying a nightmare. Her name was Evelyn Carter. Her hands trembled as she stared at the house behind the police tape. Her eyes locked on the red front door like it might open at any moment. Detective Claire Donnelly stepped closer to her. "You said your son disappeared here," Claire said gently. Evelyn nodded slowly. "Michael." Her voice cracked slightly when she said the name. "He was 7 years old." Claire gestured toward a patrol car nearby. "Let's sit down and talk." A few minutes later, Evelyn sat in the back seat of the car with a blanket around her shoulders. The flashing lights from the police vehicles painted the quiet street in red and blue. Claire opened her notebook. "Mrs. Carter, can you tell me what happened the night your son disappeared?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the house again. "It was quiet," she said finally. "Just a normal night." Her voice sounded distant, like she was replaying the memory in her head. "Michael had gone to bed around 9. Claire nodded. "And when did you realize he was gone?" "Around midnight." "What woke you up?" Evelyn hesitated. "The door." Claire looked up. "What door?" Evelyn swallowed. "The red one." Claire's pen stopped moving. "You mean the front door?" Evelyn shook her head. "No." Her eyes slowly shifted toward the house. "The other one." Claire felt the same cold uneasiness she had felt earlier in the hidden room. "The door inside the wall?" she asked quietly. Evelyn's eyes widened. "You found it?" Claire nodded once. Evelyn looked terrified now. "You shouldn't have opened it." Claire leaned slightly forward. "Mrs. Carter, what happened that night?" Evelyn took a deep breath. "I heard Michael talking." "To who?" "I don't know," she whispered. Claire wrote quickly. "Where was he?" "In the hallway." Evelyn's voice trembled slightly. "I thought he was sleepwalking." "So you went to check on him?" "Yes." "What did you see?" Evelyn's hands tightened around the blanket. "He was standing in front of the wall." Claire looked confused. "What wall?" "The hallway wall near the stairs." Claire's chest tightened. "The exact same place." "The red door was there," Evelyn continued. "It wasn't there earlier that night, but suddenly it was." Claire felt the street noise fade away around them. "And Michael?" she asked quietly. "He was talking to someone." "Who?" Evelyn's lips trembled. "I couldn't see anyone." Claire waited. "But Michael could," Evelyn whispered. Claire felt a chill run through her. "What did he say?" Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. "He kept saying, 'I can't see your face.'" Claire stopped writing again. "And then the door opened." Evelyn's breathing became uneven now. "What was inside?" Claire asked. "Nothing," Evelyn said immediately. "Just darkness." Claire remembered the same darkness she had seen earlier. "Did Michael go inside?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "I tried to grab him." Her voice broke. "But something pulled him." Claire leaned closer. "What do you mean?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "He was standing right in front of me, and then suddenly he was." Claire stayed silent. "The darkness moved," Evelyn whispered, "like it was alive. And then Michael was gone." The patrol car fell completely quiet. Claire slowly closed her notebook. "Mrs. Carter, why didn't the police find the door back then?" Evelyn gave a weak, broken smile. "Because it wasn't there anymore." Claire felt the tension building again. "What do you mean?" "The door disappears," Evelyn said. "It only shows itself when he wants it to." Claire didn't need to ask who he was. "The faceless man," she said quietly. Evelyn's eyes widened. "You've seen him too." Claire didn't answer that question. Instead, she asked another. Did anyone else see this happen? Evelyn shook her head. My husband thought I was losing my mind. What about the police? They searched the house for weeks. And they found nothing. Evelyn slowly looked back at house number 58. But I knew the truth. Claire followed her gaze. What truth? Evelyn whispered the words like they were something cursive. The door didn't take Michael. Claire frowned slightly. Then what did? Evelyn's voice dropped to almost nothing. The thing that lives behind it. At that moment, one of the officers ran toward the patrol car. Detective. Claire stepped out immediately. What is it? The officer looked shaken. You need to see this. They walked quickly back into the house. The forensic team was gathered in the hidden room again. Everyone was staring at the red door. Claire pushed through the crowd. What happened? One of the technicians pointed at the floor. Claire looked down. Her stomach dropped instantly. The scratch marks on the wooden floor had changed. Earlier, they had been leading away from the door. Now, they were fresh, deeper, and moving in the opposite direction, leading straight toward the hallway, as if something had just walked out. Claire slowly lifted her flashlight toward the red door. It was slightly open again, and from the darkness inside, something moved. Tall, still, watching. The faceless man had returned. The red door was open again. Not wide, just enough to reveal a thin line of darkness inside. But everyone in the hidden room could feel it. Something had changed. Detective Claire Donnelly slowly raised her flashlight toward the opening. The beam entered the darkness but seemed to fade quickly, like the light itself was being swallowed. The forensic technician stood completely still behind her. No one wanted to move closer. Claire stepped forward carefully. Everyone stay back, she said quietly. The scratch marks on the floor were fresh. Wood splinters were scattered around them. Whatever had made them had done so recently. Very recently. Claire's heartbeat grew louder in her ears as she reached the door. The black handle was slightly turned. Just like before. She pushed the door open another inch. The darkness inside shifted. Then, something moved. A tall shadow slid across the inside of the doorway. Several people gasped. One of the officers stepped backward. What the hell is that? Claire held her ground. The shape inside the darkness slowly leaned forward. For a moment, it almost looked human. Tall, thin, long arms hanging at its sides. But where its face should have been, there was nothing. No eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Just a smooth, pale surface. The faceless man. The room went completely silent. Claire forced herself to speak. Who are you? The figure didn't answer. It simply stood there, watching, or at least it felt like it was watching. One of the technicians whispered nervously. That thing shouldn't exist. The figure tilted its head slightly. The movement was slow and unnatural. Then suddenly, the red door slammed shut. Everyone jumped. The loud crack echoed through the hidden room. Claire grabbed the handle instantly and pulled. It wouldn't move. Locked again. The officer beside her tried too. Nothing. It's sealed, he said. Inside the house, a new sound echoed. Footsteps. Heavy. Coming from the hallway. Claire turned quickly. Did someone else come inside? The officers looked at each other. No. The footsteps grew louder. Slow. Deliberate. Step. 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 They were coming up the stairs. Everyone in the room stared toward the doorway. A moment later, a figure appeared in the hall. Thin, tall, wearing dark clothes. Susan Dolly gasped. That's him, the man from the house. Ethan's captor, the one who had vanished. He stood silently at the end of the hallway. His pale face showed no emotion. Claire stepped forward immediately. Police don't move. But the man didn't run. He didn't even react. His eyes slowly moved past Claire and settled on the red door, almost like he was checking to see if it was still there. Claire moved closer. Put your hands where I can see them. The man finally looked at her. His expression remained strangely calm. You opened it, he said. His voice sounded quiet, almost disappointed. Claire kept her gun lowered but ready. What is that door? The man smiled slightly. You shouldn't have touched it. Claire stepped closer again. You've hurt a lot of people. This ends tonight. But the man shook his head slowly. You don't understand. Behind them, the red door handle moved again. No one noticed except Claire. Her eyes flicked toward it. The handle turned. Slowly, silently, the man saw it too. And for the first time, he looked afraid. No, he whispered. The door creaked open. The same endless darkness poured into the room. And then, a long pale arm reached out. Not the man's arm. Something else. Something far taller than a human. The arm grabbed the man's shoulder instantly. He screamed. The officers rushed forward. But it was too late. The darkness pulled him backward, straight through the red door. His scream echoed for only a second. Then he was gone. The door slammed shut again. The room fell into complete silence. No movement. No sound. Claire stared at the red surface of the door, trying to process what had just happened. One of the officers whispered shakily, "Did that thing just take him?" Claire didn't answer, because something else had appeared on the wall. The drawings. There was a new one. Fresh, as if it had just been made. A child's crayon sketch. It showed the red door, the faceless man standing beside it, and another figure being dragged inside. Underneath the drawing were 3 words. He belongs here. Later that night, the police sealed the entire house. The hidden room was locked. The red door was reinforced with steel bars. But Detective Claire Donnelly couldn't forget what she had seen. Because when she visited Ethan at the hospital the next day, the boy was drawing again. Claire looked at the paper in his hands. Her blood ran cold. The drawing showed Willowbrook Lane, house number 58. And standing outside the house was the faceless man. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, more doors had appeared. The sun had barely begun to rise when the town woke to the news that something impossible had happened during the night. At first, it sounded like a rumor. People whispered about it in the bakery, outside the gas station, and in the quiet halls of the sheriff's office. The house on Willowbrook Lane had burned. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was what firefighters found inside. When the fire trucks arrived, flames had already swallowed most of the old wooden structure. The red door had collapsed inward, and smoke poured through broken windows like dark fog. Firefighters worked for nearly an hour to bring the blaze under control. When the last flames died down, the inside of the house was almost completely destroyed. Charred beams leaned against each other like skeletons. The staircase had collapsed. Furniture was gone. But in the middle of the blackened living room floor, investigators found something that stopped everyone in their tracks. A chair, perfectly intact, not burned, not damaged, just sitting there. And tied to that chair was Daniel, or at least what remained of him. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the fire, or the chair, or even the way he had been bound. It was his expression. Daniel's face was frozen in a look of pure terror, as if the last thing he saw before dying was something no human mind could understand. The town sheriff, Mark Holloway, stood silently as investigators photographed the scene. Sheriff Holloway had worked in law enforcement for nearly 30 years. He had seen accidents, violence, even murder, but he had never seen anything like this. The ropes binding Daniel to the chair were completely untouched by fire. The chair itself looked brand new. Everything around it had burned to ash, except that one small circle in the center of the room. It was as if the flames had avoided it. Deliberately, one of the firefighters spoke quietly. "Sheriff, you're gonna want to see this." Near the edge of the room, carved into the floorboards beneath the ash, was a message. The words were burned deep into the wood. 3 simple words. "I told you." Sheriff Holloway felt a cold sensation crawl up his spine, because he remembered the phone call from 2 nights earlier. The one from Daniel. Daniel had sounded terrified. He said someone had been knocking on his door every night at exactly 3:03 a.m. But when he opened it, no one was there. And then he said something else, something that now echoed inside the sheriff's mind. Daniel had whispered it like a confession. "They're not knocking to come inside. They're knocking so I know they're already here." The sheriff stared at the burned message again. "I told you." But who had written it? And why? As investigators continued searching the ruins, another discovery made the situation even stranger. Daniel's phone had somehow survived the fire. It was found inside his pocket. The screen was cracked but still working. Inside the phone was a voice recording. Timestamp 3:03 a.m. The sheriff pressed play. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then Daniel's voice appeared, whispering, shaking. "I hear them again." A slow knocking sound echoed through the recording. 3 knocks. Then Daniel spoke again. "They're inside the house now." His breathing became faster. "You said if I ignored them, they stop." A long pause followed. Then Daniel whispered something that made every investigator in the room go still. "They're standing behind me." The recording ended with a loud crash. Then silence. The sheriff slowly lowered the phone. Outside, the sun had fully risen over Willowbrook Lane. Morning light touched the burned remains of the house. But the town no longer felt peaceful, because everyone was asking the same question. If Daniel had been tied to that chair, who was knocking at his door every night, and who was standing behind him at 3:03 a.m. The sheriff closed the phone and looked at the message burned into the floor one last time. "I told you." For the first time in his career, Sheriff Holloway wasn't sure he wanted to solve a case, because some mysteries were never meant to be understood. And sometimes, the knocking never really stops.